For roughly 400 years, an entire global economy was built on kidnapping human beings, stripping them of their names, their languages, their families, and treating them as property, not employees, not servants, property, something you could own, sell, and inherit like furniture. An estimated of 12 million people were forcibly taken from Africa. Millions didn't even survive the ocean crossing, packed into shipholds so tight people couldn't even sit up, in conditions so brutal that historians describe the entire sections of the Atlantic as literal graveyards. And the ones who did survive the crossing were sold into generations of forced labor, violence, and family separation that lasted literal centuries. Here's a part that should genuinely wreck you. This wasn't some rogue evil operation hiding in the shadows. It was legal. It was mainstream. It was profitable. Entire economies, shipping industries, banks, insurance companies were built directly on top of it. People got rich off human suffering as a business model, and society mostly just let it happen for centuries. The ripple effects are still being felt today, generations later, in wealth gaps, in trauma passed down bloodlines, and systems that we've never fully dismantled. This isn't ancient history in the dinosaur sense. This is recent enough that people alive today had grandparents who lived through its direct aftermath. Colonization, which is basically what happens when a country catches the worst case of main character syndrome in human history and decides an entire continent full of people, cultures, and civilization simply doesn't count. European powers spent centuries sailing to lands that were already home to millions of people, thriving societies with their own governments, languages, religions, and history, and just claimed them, planted a flag, and said, "This is mine now." To the people who had been living there for thousands of years, what followed wasn't just land theft, it was cultural erasure on a massive scale. Languages banned, religions outlawed, children taken from families and forced into schools designed to strip them of their identity. Entire histories rewritten to paint the colonizers as heroes, bringing civilization, when in reality, they were dismantling civilizations that had been thriving long before they showed up. And the death toll wasn't just from swords and guns. Diseases brought by the colonizers wiped out staggering percentages of indigenous populations across the Americas. Some estimates suggest up to 90% of native populations in certain regions died within a century of contact. 90%, that's not a war, that's an apocalypse. The generally unhinged part, a lot of this got taught in history books for generations as an adventure story. Explorers discovering places that were never lost. It took a painfully long time for the actual body counts and cultural devastation to even be acknowledged in mainstream education. Between 1941 and 1945, the Nazi regime systematically murdered 6 million Jewish people, alongside millions of others: Roma people, disabled individuals, political descendants, LGBTQ people, in a machine of violence so calculated it still doesn't feel real when you actually sit with the numbers. What makes this different from a regular atrocity is the sheer organization of it. This wasn't chaotic violence, it is bureaucratic. Trains ran on schedules, records were kept with terrifying precision. Ordinary people, clerks, train conductors, guards, became small cogs in a machine built entirely around industrialized murder. That's the part that should actually keep you up at night. It wasn't one evil mastermind acting alone. It was millions of ordinary people going along with something evil, one small complaining decision at a time. Historians call this the danger of normalized evil, when cruelty becomes so systemized, so bureaucratic that regular people stop questioning it and just follow the process. 6 million people, erased not in a single moment of chaos, but through years of deliberate, organized administrative horror. This is why "never forget" isn't just a slogan, it is a warning about how easily normal societies can be turned into machines of mass violence when hatred gets bureaucratic ties and nobody pushes back. Here's an uncomfortable truth: the Holocaust, horrifically, is not the only genocide in modern history. It's just one of the most widely taught ones. The Rwanda genocide in 1994 saw roughly 800,000 people killed in just 100 days. That's a pace of violence almost too fast for the brain to process. Neighbors kill neighbors. Entire communities were torn apart, and what the world largely watched happen without intervening at the time. The Armenian genocide during World War I saw over a million Armenians killed by the Ottoman government. A tragedy to this day some governments still refuse to officially acknowledge as genocide. The Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s saw an estimated of 1.5 to 2 million people killed, nearly a quarter of the country's population, in an attempt to forcibly reset society back to year zero. Notice the pattern here? These aren't ancient events lost to time. Rwanda happened in the 90s. That's within the living memory of millions of people alive right now. This isn't distant history. It's recent enough that survivors are still telling these stories today. The scariest part isn't just that these things happen, it's how often the rest of the world knew and still didn't act fast enough to stop it. So here's the actual unsettling question. Why does this keep happening? Different centuries, different countries, different excuses, but the same basic playbook shows up over and over. Psychologists point to a disturbing pattern called dehumanization. Before mass atrocities happen, there's almost always a phase where one group is described as less than human: vermin, animals, disease, a threat. Once people stop seeing a group fully human, the moral guardrails that would normally stop violence just switch off. Adding propaganda, social pressure to conform, and the simple human tendency to go along with authority even when something feels wrong. And you get the exact conditions that produce every atrocity we just talked about. It's not that humans are uniquely evil, it's that humans are uniquely capable of convincing themselves that evil is justified, necessary, or even righteous. If the right story gets told enough times by the right voices to enough people, that's the actual horror, not monsters, ordinary people convinced by ordinary sounding stories, doing extraordinary harm. So why sit through these few minutes of humanity's worst moments? Because forgetting is how it happens again. Every single atrocity we just covered started small. A lawyer, a slur there, a group quietly stripped of rights, while everyone else stayed silent. By the time it became undeniable, it was already too late for millions of people. The uncomfortable truth is that history isn't a highlight reel, it's a warning label. And the things that made these atrocities possible: dehumanization, silence, blind obedience, it's not my problem energy. Those things didn't disappear. They're still floating around today, waiting for the right conditions. So next time you see dehumanization language creep into normal conversation, next time silence starts feeling easier than speaking up, remember this list. Remember how every single one of these horrors started in exactly the same way: small, deniable, and ignored until it wasn't. Humanity's worst sins weren't committed by monsters. They were committed by people who convinced themselves and each other that they weren't doing anything wrong. Don't be the generation that lets it happen quietly again.